Hi, Marcus. I'm Kathleen Booth, and I'm the SVP of Marketing and Member Experience at Pavilion. Pavilion is the leading global community for high growth revenue leaders in B2B technology. And I'm a marketer by trade. My background is I owned an agency for 11 years and sold that business back in 2017. And since then, I've been in-house at a variety of different, mostly B2B technology companies as head of marketing. And I tend to gravitate towards the early stage. I think it's the entrepreneur in me. I can't kick it. But these days, I'm at Pavilion and loving growing the community there.
So I wanted to kick it off with kind of opening up if you have any stories that you can share of times that you've been facing like a positioning, a messaging challenge. I know it's a very broad question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like every single job I've ever been in, I've had positioning and messaging challenges to tackle. I feel like that's actually the most challenging part of being a marketing leader. The one story I love sharing, honestly, goes back to my days as an agency owner. When I would work with companies in all kinds of different industries, and I happened to be working with a cybersecurity company, and they had this product that, was a software that would look at all the different threats that your company was facing and kind of tell you where, how bad they were and where you were in ameliorating them, et cetera. And they were very like wrapped up, as many of us get to be, in their own product, right? I think it's like when you're working on your own marketing, it can be very hard to see the forest through the trees. And this is one example I love to share because it's classic, right? It's like they invited us in as third parties, and we're trying to grapple with how do we talk about what we do. And they were very in the weeds around it's cybersecurity, it's threat, analysis and mitigation. And as they described the product more and more to us, granted, it was me and my lead strategist, and we had no cyber background other than we had worked with a few cyber companies, but we certainly weren't experts. And the more they started explaining it, the more I was like, this sounds a lot like business intelligence. Is it business intelligence? And they were like, well, there's no such thing as cyber business intelligence. And I'm like, why not? Like, maybe there is. And we wound up actually working with them for quite a while and positioning them as cyber BI. And they were one of the first companies to do that. They wound up getting acquired subsequently. But I think it just illustrates the point that one of the biggest challenges for us as marketers is getting out of our own heads and simplifying messaging and really thinking about how our customers frame these things. And I think with positioning and messaging, I deal with this everywhere. Like I said, I mean, I have it at Pavilion right now because one of the components of our offering is that we have Pavilion University, which is online and live virtual training for revenue leaders. And, there's a lot of places that do this type of training. And so the question always becomes like, well, how are you different? What makes Pavilion special? And that's something that we're still working on right now. And, happy to share how the sausage is being made. And right now what we're playing with is this tagline of like, we're those who do teach, because that's our big differentiator is you can take CMO school and the people teaching it are currently CMOs. Like, it's not a professor in a university or a consultant. It's people who are doing the job today. And so, those are two examples that come to mind when you talk about that question.
Yeah, and the first thing I wanted to dive a little bit more into is when you mentioned that first cybersecurity example. And I've noticed this too with client work, where sometimes just having fresh eyes by itself brings a tremendous amount of value to the project, right? Because like you said, so many marketing teams and C-level leaders they're so in the weeds. They've been working on a product launch or that brand for months or years. And of course it's hard not to be completely myopic, right? Because you've been just immersed in it. And then somebody from the outside comes in, and especially with cybersecurity, if you don't have that background, cybersecurity is its own
very complicated
monster, right?
Yeah.
Like that's its own thing. If there was ever like an industry that has its own kind of style and language, that would be it. But being able to go in and you mentioned that you kind of rebranded it as this business intelligence security. Is that how you worded it?
Cyber business
Cyber
intelligence.
business
Yeah.
intelligence. So it's like being able to see as a marketer and coming in with fresh eyes, different, you know, elements that you could pull together that they might have not even thought of, right? So I just wanted to mention, I think that's one of the things for marketers that are listening. A lot of times if you're stuck in the problem and the challenge of what is our positioning, what should the messaging say, just being able to get out of your own heads, and even internally being able to get out of the office if we're at the office, right? And just be able to get out of that same environment, right? And kickstart some ideas. But
It's funny because I sort of riffing on that a little bit.
mm,
I think it is always hard for us to explain the thing that we're so immersed in. And there was a time, one of the jobs I had, I was working in the advertising technology industry, and ad tech also can be complicated. And I hosted a podcast where I profiled ad operations team leaders, and ad operations is a complicated thing also. And there's not a lot of information out there on it. And it was funny, I always started every podcast with asking the guest, how would you explain what you do for a living to a 5-year-old or to your mother, right? Like, and that exercise too, that's like another way of doing this. You don't always have to bring in consultants, you don't have to bring in third parties, but if you just fictitiously kind of think about, if I had a 5-year-old, or if my elderly parent wanted to understand this, how would I explain it to them if they don't have the frame of reference from the industry? And it was funny, by I had done something like 30 episodes, and I saved every description because it was 30 different people describing the same job in their own way. And it was an amazing exercise in seeing how people boil things down. And at the end, I was able to really extract some great, like, plain language ways of talking about this super complex thing. So I guess for anyone listening, this is another like little hack you can use of, get everybody on your team together, or maybe do it separately, and just ask them, like, pitch this as though you're talking to a 5-year-old, and see how they would explain it.
absolutely. That's a great idea to be able to, especially allowing people to do it on their own time, right? Because it's kind of hard to do this when you're all in the same
Yeah.
room or in a Zoom. There's so much pressure to come up with something brilliant, right? So if you could just have a little bit of time to let the ideas gestate. I wanted to take a step back too and get your, I was listening to a podcast the other day when they were going around. It was like a panel discussion. They were like, describe, I think it was product marketing, right? Like, what is product? So like you got like 4 different answers, right? Because everybody has their own idea about it. So I think the same thing happens with positioning messaging. And I'd love to hear, what is your definition of positioning, and
Oh.
what's your definition of messaging, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do think they're different. I think we do tend to use them interchangeably very often in the marketing world, but to me, positioning is like where you fit within the broader market landscape, like how you are perceived with reference to the competitive set that you're a part of. Whereas messaging is the words you use to affect the positioning you're trying to affect, if that makes sense.
It does. And I wanted to go back to your, the definition of positioning you say about like how you relate in the context to the competition. Where do you see audience segmentation or ICP segmentation in there? So like, kind of as a copywriter by trade, and I think about like who am I writing for, right? And I think one of the biggest challenges when you're trying to come up with messaging copy isn't coming up with something clever, because I think too many people are trying to be clever, right? And it's like, well, who am I speaking to? And one of the challenges in a project is if it's like, well, small business owners, like, okay, like what, who,
Are we
like,
talking a bakery or a small cybersecurity company? These are very different
exactly,
things.
exactly. And what, I always gravitate toward what is the problem they're experiencing, because it might not be even an industry thing. It might not have anything to do with whether it's a retail or it's a consultant. It might even just be like they're dealing with this problem. And I read recently there's a book that recently came out called Awaken Your Genius. He made a really good point about I think he used Bruce Springsteen as an example. Like Bruce Springsteen was never going to be able to compete based on like his guitar playing or his voice, but his songwriting, that's where his kind of special genius was. And so that's what he focused on. And I think it's Ozan Varol is the author, and he brought up a really good point about like when we look at the most, or we look for the most obvious target, the biggest part of the target, right? And everybody's shooting for the same thing. And I just thought it's such a great analogy for positioning, because I see that so much with SaaS or any B2B. It's like they're all trying to be cybersecurity, right? They're like just general, and it makes it much harder to figure out like the positioning beyond just who we're competing with. But more importantly, like, because the customer doesn't really care why we're different, right? They just care about like how we're going to help them. And in order to say that, we have to be able to know exactly what they're dealing with. So that's kind of like not really even a question, but just an open-ended thing. And I want to see if you could just riff on that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different angles to that. And so I'll kind of introduce a few of them in no particular order. The first being, you said one thing that I think is spot on, which is that very often the thing the customer cares the most about has nothing to do with your product or how they use it, which I totally agree with, because I've heard stories of this over the years. I used to host a podcast for 5 years where I interviewed marketers, and I heard so many great stories of like what really worked in marketing and with different campaigns. And I'll never forget one interview I did with Stephanie Baoki. Funny enough, I interviewed her, and then she came to work for me at a company I later worked at. And she had done a campaign, a marketing campaign that was trying to sell medical waste disposal solutions to essentially office managers of medical practices. And like, who wants to talk about medical waste all the time? Nobody, right? Like, and everybody already has a solution, by the way, because you literally legally cannot run a medical practice unless you have this in place. And so they were always trying to unseat competitors, and they weren't having any luck with their marketing until they really started thinking about like, what do these office managers really care about? It's not really medical waste. That's sort of a check the box thing. They found out that one of their biggest pain points was no-shows, people who didn't show up for their appointments. And so they started creating marketing content around dealing with no-shows and giving office managers templates of like letters to send to no-shows. And that was the thing that actually got them the most traction and like got them appointments and relationships built with their target audience. And it was because they solved a real problem that this audience had. And so I do think as marketers, we tend to get very focused on like the world as it relates to our product. And that is really not very effective. And funny enough, that I'll bring it full circle. Last week, I went to this amazing event in Washington, D.C. that a friend of mine organized for it was all these women entrepreneurs and leaders that came to it. And the event was held at the Dior boutique in Washington, D.C. And we went into the private room where they sell all their high-end stuff. And they had a woman from Dior, New York, come down and speak to us. And she's the person who goes to all their boutiques and trains all their new sales associates. And why this is relevant is Dior is known like around the world for its incredible customer service, for its brand reputation. Like they've really nailed their marketing. And one of the things she talked about was in her training for new employees, she teaches them that, they want to create individualized experiences for every customer. And how do you do that? She said, well, we train them to speak to the customers, and the goal of every interaction, no matter who the customer is, whether they're the richest person in the world who just walked in to spend a ton of money, or they're a college student who is living on a shoestring, you treat them the same, you get into a conversation, and the goal is to walk away with knowing 3 things about that person that have nothing to do with the product. So the conversation shouldn't result in she prefers Kelly green bags versus red bags. It should be, she has a daughter whose birthday is coming up, and she likes to golf, right? Because that's how you establish commonalities. That's how you build an emotional tie in a relationship. And I think the same lesson learned can really be applied to B2B marketing, right? It's like most people, like if you're just competing on product features and functionality, it's very hard to stand apart. And the brands that really like kill it these days are the ones that build strong brands and like loyal followings. And they don't do that by having great messaging around, how their checklist of offerings differs from somebody else. They do it because they've invested in a brand that people truly love and have an emotional connection to. And to develop that emotional connection, you have to tap into something that has nothing to do with your product, right? Like, it's the same lesson that Dior has figured out that can be applied in B2B. Only I think for some reason, as B2B marketers, we think we're exempt from that rule, right? That like purchasing is an emotional exercise, and we somehow think it's very clinical, and which is not to say that we don't need to nail the clinical part of it, and we don't need to do a good job at conveying our offerings and the value they deliver, but we also need to recognize that at the end of the day, there's a person on the other end making the purchase and advocating for the purchase. And if they're going to put their reputation behind advocating for the purchase, there is that emotional component to getting them to do it. So I'll stop there. I could keep going because I think this is a fun topic, but
No, I love that. Absolutely. And I'm thinking when I picture Dior, and I picture that kind of personalized attention and that building a relationship. And then we talk about the juxtaposition between that and B2B. And one thing that really pops in my head is over the last few years, especially this move towards scalability, this move toward automation with everything. It's almost like if it can't be scaled and automated, then it's not worth doing. And maybe it's a result of the real boom in growth of VC money coming in, and they just want to show seats, and they just want to show how many SDRs are in seats sending emails, whatever it is, right? But it is a very different approach, because if you're Dior and you're training your people to create that connection that leads to real clients and customers, that's a very different approach than if you're working for, let's say, a B2B SaaS, where the whole goal is how do we penetrate the market and how do we get as much traction as possible with as many possible customers so we can show this growth. It's it's almost like the one-to-one relationships that build to that is almost like, well, yeah, but we don't have time for that, right? I mean, you probably get, like anybody, lots of email pitches or solicitations. How many are written that are just like, it's like, forget bots. Like, I'm not worried about ChatGPT. I'm just the people that write them. It's just kind of like the most generic thing. So I think that that's like a really important thing to keep in mind, especially with higher end products. Like, they're selling things that are quite expensive, right? We're not talking about like a Dropbox account where it really should just be automated. But I think that really brings up a good point. What would you suggest to people as far as like they're in an organization where they want to be able to really drill down on the positioning and the messaging so that they can create that kind of connection with the ideal prospects and the ideal customers of the future? Any suggestions you can offer for helping kind of move toward that?
yeah, I mean, and I think you raised an important point, and I want to acknowledge this, that like the way Dior goes about things, while they have achieved scale, it's not necessarily applicable to everybody listening, just because Dior's average purchase price is quite high, right? And so they can afford to be very, very personalized. But I think the lesson that you can extract from that is applicable across the board, even if you're in a PLG motion where your CAC has to be, your cost of acquiring a customer has to be very low. There are other ways of accomplishing it, because like really at the heart of what I'm talking about is establishing an emotional connection with your buyer. And that doesn't have to occur through a conversation, right? It can occur in different ways, but to be able to establish that, you first need to understand what are those things that will appeal at an emotional level to your buyer. What are their fears? What are the things that keep them up at night? What are the things that stress them out? And like a great example is, we host a lot of dinners at Pavilion, and I was in San Francisco recently for our CMO summit, and I hosted a dinner the night before it was probably 15 CMOs, very, very accomplished CMOs. And our dinner formats, one of the things we do is we ask everyone to go around the table and say what the biggest challenge is that they're facing right now. And if you're selling to CMOs, like you might be thinking they'd say something like, oh, sales cycles are slowing down and we're not hitting our pipeline numbers. And there certainly was conversation around that, but the number one thing I heard around that table over and over and over, and the thing that got them like jazzed up to talk about was like, we're at this point in our careers where we no longer want to kill ourselves working. We want to build time in to spend with our families and for ourselves. Like, how do we achieve that fictional balance that everyone's looking for? So it's nothing to do with anybody's product or the specificity of their job. It's like the stage in their career. And so it was just very interesting. I think that that's really telling that, like, if you're marketing to CMOs, for example, all that other stuff like around pipeline and leads and like, yeah, there's a time and a place when we think about that. But the thing that really emotionally resonates with us is time and time with family and recapturing that time for ourselves after careers spent really working a lot. And so if I were to take the lesson of Dior and apply it to, for example, a marketing strategy to sell to CMOs, I would probably think through things like, is there, not only in the messaging and how I talk about the problems CMOs have, like I would certainly incorporate things around saving time and finding balance and getting more efficient, but that still sounds kind of clinical. To me, what would get me excited is, can I start like a podcast where I interview, chief marketing leaders and have them talk about like how they're balancing everything and the strategies they have for making their lifestyle more manageable while still excelling in the workplace. Like, that's the kind of thing I think people would get excited about and want to follow and listen to. And I think would get you results. And that's the kind of thing that builds that emotional bridge. And like a podcast is just a great example because it's a conversation at a very personal level. You're achieving that same degree of intimacy and emotional connection as you would in a conversation with a salesperson, because as a brand, you're allowing the listener to feel like they're being let in on a private conversation. And very often your podcast guest is also your target audience, and even better. So
Sometimes that does happen. Absolutely. And I your example there is I want you to play around with a thought experiment with me for a moment. So, because it brings up one of the challenges I see with positioning and choosing what problem you're going to solve for who and creating that emotional connection. So let's go into hypothetical land, right? So we both work at this company that is trying to sell into CMOs, right? And you have this idea of like, hey, I know from experience that this is what their challenges are. So this is how we can create this emotional bond with them and relationship, and we can start a podcast. And one of the pushback you experience includes, oh yeah, that's great, but what about all the other CMOs, right? That wouldn't necessarily be part of that group. And I think that's from as a contractor or a copywriter, or even within an agency, I see that as being kind of the tension, right? Because it's like, oh yeah, let's be really targeted. Let's really hone in on it. But we don't want to have to exclude anybody as far as like, what about that target market and that other one? So I just like, what would you do to approach that? I know that's a really loaded question.
No, I mean, it's like probably the number one question. And I've over my years of agency work, I had that conversation all the time. And I can say with total confidence and certainty that when you try to appeal to everyone, you appeal to no one. And it's like, watering down your messaging to the lowest common denominator. And so, yes, specificity, niching down is very, very powerful. It can be scary, but it's very, very powerful. And that's where you develop that ardent following, the loyal people that love your brand, because the most powerful thing is when somebody can come to your website or experience your marketing and it feels like it's speaking directly to them. Like, that is when you really know you've gotten them. And that won't happen if you're trying to appeal to everybody.
Absolutely. And as I alluded to earlier in the conversation, that is the biggest challenge as a copywriter, right? Because it's hard enough to write something that's going to resonate with a hypothetical group of strangers, right? That you have to try to get into their world. But it's really hard to do that when it's just a generic kind of like, people that run businesses, or people that have secure, IT security concerns or whatever.
Well, think about this. Here's an interesting thought experiment for
Mm,
anyone listening. I mean, I feel like Chat GPT is all the rage these days. Um, and if you've played around with it, it's interesting. Like it's not going to put copywriters out of business any day soon, I don't think, because like everything it comes out with still needs to be massaged and worked on. But if you've played with it, you know that if you just put in, for example, like for example, I have an AI company I advise, and if I just put in write a blog about why AI is useful for businesses, the result I would get would be dramatically different than if I write a blog on why AI is useful for chief marketing officers. Think about the difference. Like you just know this inherently from if you've played with ChatGPT, and it's like it's a smart software, but it's also very, very dumb, right? Like it's responding to what you tell it to do. And the same thing is true like in marketing, if I'm not saying audiences are dumb, but like they're going to respond to what you're giving them. And if you're giving a generic message, sure, it can apply to everybody, but it's not like really strongly applicable to anyone. Versus if you go the level of specificity, like I described with ChatGPT, I would probably get a blog out that would be pretty close to like a much more finished product that would resonate and would seem like I, as a marketing leader, would respond to, versus the other blog which checks a box, but I don't know anybody who it would resonate with because it's too generic.
yeah. And there's many, many generic blogs out there for sure.
Oh yeah.
A big part of whether you're a marketing advisor, as a consultant, or you're, CMO advising the CEO on strategy, like the pushback that I mentioned earlier against specificity. There we go. Like I'm a big believer in order to be able to do your job as a marketing leader or as a marketer in general, you have to know how to sell, and you have to know how to sell your ideas and strategies internally, right? Because otherwise you can have the best ideas in the world, but if it all just defaults to status quo, it won't matter. And we're just going to be churning out the same thing as everybody else. What would be the business case, the logical business reason for a CEO or a leader of a company to say, no, we're not going to narrow down our niche, and here's why? Because to think of it from their perspective, so that when we're making that case for being more specific, we can do it with their perspective in mind. It's almost like that's our audience in that case, right? To understand that audience. I just was wondering if you might be able to like riff on that a bit.
Sure. I mean, so I'm dealing with this right now with a company I advise where they are an AI company and they have a product that is very specific to e-commerce companies. Like they're selling an e-commerce SaaS, as that's an AI SaaS. But their long-term roadmap is to be an AI company, right? And there's a lot of them, Data IQ companies like that are AI companies first, and they have many different AI products. So we don't want to have them be known as a niche e-commerce product company, right? Because then when they introduce their next product in healthcare, people are going to be like, why would I buy a healthcare AI product from an e-commerce company, right? And so these challenges do exist, and they're legitimate challenges. But I think the way you deal with them is you have two levels of messaging, right? Like with this particular company, the highest level of messaging on their website is around them being an AI company first and speaking to like the issues that AI solves and the pain points that people think about around the use of AI in business writ large. But then there's a whole separate set of messages around the product itself and how we go to market with the product. And then when you have this like duality, you really do have to think very carefully about when do we go to market with our product messaging versus our company messaging. And so that is a tricky balancing act. One of my favorite things to do is I do love looking at companies like the Data IQs of the world that are 5, 6, 7 years down the road with this. And I love going back into the Wayback Machine and looking at their websites in the early days and seeing like, how did they talk about themselves back then? Because it obviously worked out really well for them and in different industries, but it's a fun thought exercise to go through to see how the messaging has evolved over time.
Yeah, that's a great idea too. I need to actually start doing more of that, because it does, even though you can't really see what's happening in the background that sparks those changes, because it really could be anything, right? But to be able to see the difference, and your point about the high level and the more granular messaging is really important too, because you see this especially with the larger companies that have more complex product offerings, and they are hitting into different industries and sectors and verticals and all this stuff. And it's impossible to grow to that level if you're going to try to just be niche with everything, right? But one thing that's nice about messaging, and by association positioning, is your messaging can be as granular as you want it to be, right? Because messaging is the email you send to a specific prospect, right? So, to your point, you can have kind of this overall, what we might say is a little bit more generic, right? It's a little bit more broad messaging that deals with the high level, maybe, business use case, or the business value prop. And then when it comes to the actual like campaigns, there really is no reason at that point, if you're going to be like focusing your team, whether it's the sales team or the marketing team, social media, whatever, you can't hit every prospect. So you might as well hit the ones that have something in common, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, breaking it up into campaigns, into channels, into audiences, like that's when you dive into those deeper layers of specificity, and you can get really like pointed in how you message to particular audiences.
So to wrap up, what would be kind of top of mind for you right now of what you're talking to people when it relates to positioning messaging, as far as like advice that you would give somebody if you were at the, let's say, an event, and they were dealing with this kind of challenge?
I mean, that's a tough one. Like, because there's so many different facets of this. I think that the number one thing is to simplify dramatically, and to really try to speak in the words that your audience uses, and to establish that emotional connection. Easier said than done. But then the other piece of it that I actually think is where so many marketers run into problems is rollout, um, execution, and consistency. I think marketers are good at being consistent with their own work product, but great messaging needs to be deployed consistently throughout an entire company. And so that's getting the sales team, speaking from the same script. That's your customer success team, your CEO, when they go and do speaking engagements or get interviewed on podcasts. It's having everybody talking about the company and the products and the messaging the same way. That's hard. And I think the companies that do that well are the ones that you really see get traction.
Yeah, that's a really, really important point. And to be able to, whatever the method is, some kind of central point of truth to operate from. And that central point of truth is going to be fluid. It's a living document. I don't care whether it's a Google Doc or whatever it is, right? It doesn't have to be super sophisticated. But I see so many times where messaging just kind of evolves in this weird telephone game like way, where you start out with like your idea, and then 10 blog posts in, or 3 product pages in, or you have a new writer come in, and then all of a sudden like the difference is substantial, only because you have so many different people coming in that all have their own tastes. And I think that's where it really can get problematic, is when you're chasing subjective opinions about it that's not really based on anything, that's like, even if we just came up with it and invented a reason, that it's coming from some kind of core messaging brief. How do you actually deal with that? Just as to really wrap it up, like on the last thought here for you, what do you suggest? You go into a company as an advisor or as an agency or internally, and it's like, okay, we're going to roll out the messaging or continue to develop it. What's the method that you use to keep everything in order?
I mean, I'm not going to pretend to have nailed this perfectly, but I will say having a great product marketing leader is really helpful. Somebody who truly can own this, and can own enablement, because look, people are inherently lazy, and we're going to do what's easy for us, including like, we all have conversational narratives that we find roll off the tongue when someone says, what does your company do? Why should I buy from you? And getting somebody to change how they talk about that is not easy. And so we need to make it as easy as possible for them. We need to supply them with the enablement materials. We need to give them the decks and the PDFs and the call scripts and, all of those workflows that the emails, et cetera, so that they're not having to invent it on their own. To the extent possible, I think that that's crucial. And then look, you pair all that enablement with, ideally you've got some kind of call recording software. So you're listening to how people are talking about the company. Somebody's got the responsibility to audit that and figure out the follow-up loop of so-and-so isn't really following the messaging, how we need to provide them with more training. It's a closed loop system that incorporates the enablement, the training, the listening, the monitoring, et cetera.